All right, so I promise we have been trying to start on time, but maybe that's just a lost cause by now. Can the mic pick me up okay? Yeah, can everybody hear me? Okay. So our next panel is going to be a panel on improving diversity. One thing we wanted to do here is to see if we can talk to some folks that have sort of been there, done that, and have done it well. And so the panelists you see up here are pretty much they paved the way for what we do here today. They've come up with a lot of programs, a lot of initiatives. They've touched a lot of people's lives, including mine. So it's a very distinguished panel, and I'm really glad to be moderating and to be talking to these folks up here. So I'll give some quick introductions, and then we'll get going. So of course there's a lot of information on all of you guys. So I'll say some of it, and then maybe for some of them I'll tell a little story of my experience with them. Right? So we'll start with Tony here. Tony is, I guess, Director of Strategic Diversity and Inclusion at Lawerence Livermore. He's also a Senior Management Advocate for Diversity and Inclusion at the lab. He's been responsible for seeing the lab's interaction and successful execution in building, partnering, collaborating with government, with industry, with education, and he's got a wealth of experience. My story with Tony, the first time I met him was at Tapia conference. A lot of you have probably attended Tapia. It's a conference on diversity in computing. And the first year I was going to attend, my advisor, he had a bunch of people attend from the group, and before we were going to the conference, he wanted to let everybody know, who do you need to talk to, right? So you need to get to know these people. They're important. They are sort of top in the field. And the first person that comes out of his mouth is Tony Baylis. He said, "Oh, everybody knows Tony. You've got to know Tony. He's going to be working registration. So when you come up, tell him you're from Auburn, and make sure you introduce yourself." And ever since then, I've been to a lot of events with him. He's helped coordinate it and get funding and do a lot of those things for a lot of folks. So, great person to know. Make sure you introduce yourself. Next is Jan Cuny, and she's Program Officer at the BPC, Program Participation in Computing at NSF. So a lot of the funding for programs like this come from her office. And so if NSF is tied and it's broadening participation in computing, you can almost be sure if some of the money came from there. So very important person to have up here. When I wanted to put this panel together, I wanted to have NSF there and to have that participation. I'm glad it came. She founded the BPC program, and that helps students get post-secondary degrees and has emphasis on underrepresented groups among doing a lot of those things. Before NSF, she was faculty at NCS at Purdue, at UMass, and University of Oregon, and her research centered on programming environments for computation science. So I hadn't met Jan before today, at least not in person, but as BPDM is sort of growing, and as we've been planning, we've had conversations with Tony, with Raquell, with Valerie Taylor, also at Texas A&M. And every time we talk to them and we say, we're going to need funding, and how do we grow this and that, and as soon as we say NSF, they say Jan Cuny. And so very quickly, her name came up a lot in our conversations. Next is Raquell Holmes. Raquell is the founder of Improvscience. She's a trained cell biologist, and also has her training from the Eastside Institute, including in improvisational science and performance to build collaborative learning. She's done interdisciplinary research and education in computational sciences, and making use of modeling, simulation, and visualization tools. And I guess my story with Raquell is the first year I attended the Broadening Engagement Program at Supercomputing. They have some introductions, and it's a lot of people. The program is actually very well put together. It's I think a couple hundred people now, and I remember not knowing a whole lot of people, and now we've got to do this improvisational get together, and I'm like, oh Lord, how is this gonna be? And by the end of it, it was so cool. It was so, everybody was talking to each other. We were making connections, and it was just really nice to see sort of scientists and engineers sort of let loose and have fun. So that was a really good introduction to Raquell for me. Next is Elizabeth Bautista. She's group lead for the Operations Technology Group, team at the first line of NERSC and ESNet, Energy Science Network. She joined NERSC in '99 and worked as a technical difficulties. Worked in computer operations and network support, as well as workstation support as a team lead. She has a BS in Information Systems and MBA in Information Technology, both from Golden State University in San Francisco. Nice to see San Francisco get a shout out. And she was a previously lab delegate at Council of University of California Staff Assembly. With Elizabeth, I know we haven't interacted a whole lot, but when I saw her name, she was coming here, and then looked her up, I quickly remembered, oh yeah, I've seen her at Broader Engagement, I've seen her at Grace Hopper, I've seen her at the Tapping Conference, and so she keeps sort of getting into these initiatives and helping to coordinate, helping to sort of make sure everybody's at the right place and all this, and so a lot of experience there too. Last but certainly not least is Monica Anderson, Associate Professor at the Department of CS at University of Alabama. She has a PhD from University of Minnesota and a bachelor from Chicago State, both CS. And then she also worked in software engineering between her CS and PhD, working on point of sale and store systems for Target. She has, I guess, at least last check, about 45 publications and grants over $1.5 million. And I know she's now in a huge grant with IMCS, which is African American or Institute for African American Mentoring in Computer Sciences. So they're also doing a lot of work in broadening participation in sort of increasing diversity. With Monica, I said a little story for her. The first year I met Monica, I was a student at Auburn. Auburn and Alabama don't really see eye to eye. They're in-state rivals. And she had a team at this robotics competition, and we had a team from Auburn at this robotics competition. And I really wanted to, hate her in Alabama because I was at Auburn, but she's so nice, and I was like, dang it. So I met her at Auburn. We'll start with those introductions, and then maybe we'll just get right to the questions. Anybody who sort of wants to answer all of you, that's fine. I'll pass the mic around. So we'll start with just diversity again. A lot of people see diversity differently. A lot of organizations have different definitions of diversity. How would you say, what does diversity mean to you in the context of your experience, in the context of the organization?
Okay. So at NSF, they define diversity to look at the underrepresentation of groups relative to their occurrence in the population. So for computer science, the underrepresented groups are women, African Americans, Hispanic, and then Native Americans, Indigenous people, Alaskan Natives as one group, and persons with disabilities. This is not a small niche group. It's 70% of our population. So it's really a group that needs attention. And of course, diversity is a bad word, right? Because diversity implies that you have people from each group. But you could get away with if you had 100 people and had one African American, one Hispanic, one Native American, one female, one person with disability. That group is now diverse, but we wouldn't really consider that diverse, right? We really want people to be reflective of their representation in the population. So NSF is shifting slowly, I think, but shifting to be inclusive. In other words, that we want our communities to be inclusive of the population in general. And there is no way to argue that computer science is inclusive.
I would say it's actually hard as well to get rid of that word diversity. That's it. I don't think it's like that. I think you guys are hearing me, my voice. You know, when I took over the office that I have currently, I was trying to figure out how to actually change that word diversity, because it has certain stereotypes and perception. And it's very difficult to actually define it for a lot of folks, because they'll define it as race, color, ethnicity. They'll just go all down that spectrum. And then from there, it turns to a little switch in their head, and it becomes a little negative connotation. Then they start associating fashion and other things to it, which you're not really trying to do. And what you're trying to do is exactly what Jane said, build an inclusive environment. And so I actually added the word inclusion to it for that purpose, because it was just very difficult before. I'll add to what I think that diversity also means: diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds, especially as it pertains to, I work in a national security laboratory, and we actually need that sort of diverse spectrum of ideas coming from a wide group of individuals. And if we don't have that, how are we solving problems for kind of like what they do here? Everybody's doing things for social good. We do things for national security good that you don't know about. But it is important that we actually have all the right players at the table to be able to introduce ideas. Now, whether or not those ideas are accepted, that's a different story. But that's part of the inclusion piece.
You guys both said my favorite word, inclusion. And I think because it's also the method by which we can create inclusion, diversity. So however you define diversity, if you don't have an inclusive process, then how are people going to be retained? Why do you stay there? So I saw this one YouTube, it was someone saying, oh, inclusion is not enough. But I think what she was referring to was access is not enough. It's not enough just to say, oh, well, you can walk through the door. The question is, how do people participate in shaping the organizations that they're in? How is it that they're able to be a part of defining the future, contributing, leading? And that is, to me, a question of inclusion. It's having your voice shape things. So when you start looking at, do you have an inclusive environment, you then open the door and the retention process for everyone, right? But that then means that that 70% can actually be present and active.
And my favorite word, broadening participation. So it isn't just about being inclusive, but the way I see it, it's about having the programs accessible to everybody, so that you have a diverse pool of candidates. And I'm all about programs that increase participation to everybody, so that that 70% of the population of a community will have access to the same type of resources as everybody else.
Can I answer this with when you do the next question?
Yeah, sure.
You have the mic so we can't ask the next question.
I'm sorry.
And the next question is.
We could start with one.
Yeah, there we go. I can also sit over there, I guess. So, why does your particular institution or organization care about diversity? Maybe we should start there. I guess we're assuming that all of these organizations, obviously we as individuals care, but why does your institution care?
Okay, so I'm from the University of Alabama, and we're the flagship institution of the state of Alabama, not Auburn. And as the flagship institution, part of our mission, of course, is to serve and be a service to the population of Alabama. So I'm going to look at it slightly differently. I look at it from a socio-economic status, and I'm not saying you guys are wrong, but you know, when I come into work every day, or why I can make this case to the people I work with, it's important because 27% of African Americans live in poverty, 23% of Hispanics live in poverty, 12% of whites, and so it's 15% overall. Our stakeholders care that they have a population that can participate in what we call the American dream. Our stakeholders, which would be industry in Alabama, were very hugely automotive manufacturing, Mercedes, Toyota, Chevy, Ford. They want people in their population that understand computer science, understand computational thinking. They don't need people in factories to run a drill. They need people in factories that can run robots that run drills. And so when I look at this, our institution cares about the well-being of the people of the state of Alabama, and the well-being has to do with, of course, being able to create a stable income. You know, my personal feeling is that, you know, the age of the service profession is over. To be middle class and be in the service profession is going to actually be the exception, not the rule. The other thing, too, is having a degree, particularly computer science, provides mobility between the classes. One of the things that makes America great is that the class that you're born into isn't necessarily the class that you'll actually be in. And education is a huge factor in providing mobility between classes. So it's important that we obviously include students, or include people, all the people in computational thinking, computer science, so they can participate in this new economy.
Well, okay. So primarily, it's because we want to be able to have a diverse pool of scientists and engineers at the lab. How else are we going to be able to do the great science that we do and be able to retain them? And we feel that the more diverse our workforce is, basically the better we are able to do our mission.
So, actually, I'm going to pass because I want to.
Okay, well, I personally agree with everything that Monica said, right? Those are my personal motivations for being in this area, this kind of equity, social justice, and what kind of society do I personally want to live in. But that's not the argument that carries the most weight with many of the audiences that I talk to. NSF's goals overall are to build a robust research community, to build a globally competitive workforce, and to provide for a computationally savvy citizen. Right? So there's three aspects of it. There's no way that we can chalk up a success if we left out 70% of the population. Right? It's not going to happen. I think the argument that I really like was an argument that was used in 1988 by David Cromwell, who was a lawyer hired by the NFL. And one of the things he was told to do was to go talk to the owners, because at that point, while there were tons of black players, there were no black coaches. And so his job was to go talk to the owners. So he believed all the arguments that Monica has said, I'm sure, about equity and social justice, but he didn't think that that was going to sway the day with the owners. So he went in and he said, and I don't have the exact quote here, but I'm paraphrasing it, if you asked me to go out and find a linebacker and I came back with you after a national search and every application that I gave you was from a guy named Smith, you'd be really suspicious. You'd ask, aren't there any Joneses out there who might be a great linebacker? But the NFL is stuck on Smith. And that's exactly what's happening in computer science. We're stuck on our image of what a computer scientist is, and we're missing a lot of people. I went to a meeting once where I talked to a guy who was extremely high up in one of the major IT companies. And I talked to him about high school, which I'll talk about later today, and how important I think that is. And he said, there's no reason to teach computer science in high school because the smart kids all get it on their own. Well, I said to him, there's 70% of the population that's not participating. Are you telling me there's not a single smart person in that 70%? You know, of course, that's a totally bogus argument that smart people get it on their own. Smart people whose dads are engineers who got computers when they were 3 and 4 that had great internet connectivity, that do summer camps and all sorts of research, extra experiences. That's who gets it on their own, and they're not getting it on their own. They're getting it from the world around them, and anybody who doesn't have it in the world around them isn't getting it. So I think that it's really important from NSF's perspective. It's important for our national security. It's totally important for our economy, and there are many, many reasons why it's important. So I think that you can target your message to a whole lot of different audiences.
So I would agree with Dan and Monica and what they stated. Why our laboratory, similar to Elizabeth, is really concerned about this is that the issue is we've actually had a number of, the laboratory's been around since 19. So they've done it, been successful without a lot of different methods, and very successful. Solving a lot of global problems. So what they've come into now is that there's a transition period. We actually have the capability of a lot of those people, they stay around for their career, and they can move around their jobs. The issue that we have is that a number of those individuals are carrying that historical knowledge with them. We have a lot of young people that are coming in that, especially in computer science, have the capability to move around Silicon Valley. They're getting headhunted like crazy. And so what we're trying to do is really find individuals who care about science, who actually have a passion for it, that actually love being in a research environment that looks for innovation, looks for creativity, all right? And as a result, what we want is to really include the individuals, 70%, that haven't been included. All right, and it's all about a lack of knowledge, unconscious biases that we have in our laboratory that are actually there because those people didn't necessarily socialize in the same environment. They didn't go to some schools, they maybe didn't go to some conferences. And as a result, we feel that we should be tapping that knowledge base a lot more. Right now, we have an age demographic issue that we're trying to deal with as well. And that age demographic is trying to really culturally change and shift how people think about the world and science that we do. We're still going to go out and solve really complicated problems, but there are innovative young people coming in today that actually have different experiences that can actually solve them a little bit differently, perhaps. And as a result, what we want to try and do is tap into that and leverage it as much as possible. And I think that's where we were missing, is that we didn't understand that breadth of knowledge that was out there and how we can tap into it that would benefit us. And I think we're doing that now. We're trying to shift that. So we care about it for that particular reason, is to really try to leverage the ideas, creativity of solving problems.
And you can put on the mic to get something more.
So the innovation and creativity. So if you do look at creativity, research, innovation comes from groups working together with different ideas and different experiences. So if you always have the same kind of assumptions going into solving a problem, you will not have an innovative approach because you all agree we should just go straight forward. We don't have to go to the left, we don't have to go to the right. Why would we look over there? When you have a different social economic background, a different discipline, training, you ask a different question. So this gets back to what Elizabeth and Tony were just saying about if you want a workforce that's actually going to create innovation, you have to optimize social interactions that come from different perspectives. Right? So if you've only gotten a slice of that, you're not getting your innovation. So that's one argument that people are raising in terms of looking at diversity. For myself, in terms of improv science, what Monica raised in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds is critical to me. I believe that scientists and science has a capability of contributing to America's solution in terms of race and poverty issues. We don't talk about it, right? It's because we're only supposed to talk about our science first. So there's this issue of, again, how do you associate with the terms of diversity? But we really do have the ability to say, I want everyone to come to the table and look at these questions of solving a problem in computing. We're going to open the doors broadly. We're going to create an innovative team, and we're going to put our resources behind that. And that team is going to look more like the whole demographic of America, not a slice of it.
So the next question is sort of regarding minorities at these conferences, right? So we could be having this program at some offsite, probably be a lot cheaper than with the cost in New York, could bring more students, etc. And a lot of you guys have also participated in conferences like supercomputing, top conference in high performance computing, and have organized similar programs. Why is it important to bring students to, or to have minorities and underrepresented groups participate in these top level conferences?
So I've been a huge advocate for this, and we were actually talking about it related to supercomputing, because we have a program there that's brought participation in high performance computing, she said. And the biggest thing for me was there was a lack of awareness by a lot of the 70%. They didn't even know what high performance computing was, networking, storage, what data, what was all involved. It just totally didn't know. And as a result, why not introduce them to it? Because then that helped them sort of broaden their thinking about what it is they can do. So a lot of students basically are sitting in a classroom learning algebra-oriented skill sets, but they don't know what they're going to do, how they're going to apply. And as a result, they basically are lost. There's students still today, not one internship in their 4 years. They need to do that. They're not even going to a conference. Some of them don't even know they're conferences. So they don't have a lot of exposure. And for whatever reason, it's not getting to them at their institutions as well. And it's not every institution, but it's a good majority. You'll find that a lot of students, just that lack of awareness is not there. So I think it's very important to introduce students to it so you can broaden your thinking and frame a direction of where you might find your passion. That's the whole thing about this. It's about finding your passion. You chose this area for a reason. Something about it really speaks to you, and you're good at it. So let's figure out where you can focus that passion in a manner that really helps elevate you to another level.
So as a female minority, attending computing science type technical conferences, you can imagine what it was like for most of my career. And I think it's great in the last few years that we're now bringing underrepresented minority and students to these type of technical conferences, because we're now able to show you that these things, these resources are available to you. And you can have mentorship, you can meet people, and you don't need to go to a conference or an event and be so intimidated, right? And obviously, the big part of it is you learn a lot technically, and in an environment that you feel safe, and you see different people around you, not just one type of person, one type of people.
So this is where I'm going to tell my personal story, but I promise to keep it really short. So when I was in high school, I wasn't exactly brilliant, but I scored at like the 99th percentile in the PSAT. And I did go to college. I only took the ACT because, you know, I was going into the Army, but I did end up going to college. There were some really instrumental people that helped me find the money to go to school. I'm from the south side of Chicago, if you didn't know that. So coming out of college with a computer science degree, my GPA was about a 3.74, missed that highest category just by a little bit. My GPA in my major was a 4.0. And I had a job offer before I ever started my last semester in college. However, I was never asked to go to a conference. I was never asked if I wanted to get a PhD. I didn't know what research was. And you know, part of getting these undergraduate students to these conferences is inviting them to the conversation, showing them that there is more there. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of people like me, that you can have a 4.0 in your major and nobody asks you if you want to get an advanced degree.
The importance of these sessions is that we do not have a philosophy of remedial attention. What we're saying is if you want to develop the pool of, if you want to have a diverse group, I'm just going to keep using diversity even though we've already defined diversity as inclusion, right? When we're talking about inclusion, what you do is you open the door to the best, the greatest, and you say, rise to the challenge. We say, this is what it is, this is what's going on. We're not dumbing anything down. We're not saying, oh, well, you need to catch up. We're saying, hey, you're smart, you're intelligent, this is what's going on, here's what you've got. And so at a top-end conference, that's the expectation. And it creates a visible intentionality. I'm borrowing from Valerie Taylor on this one, and I love that she said it. It makes it visible that the conference has a commitment to having excellence, not by excluding people, but with including people. We want the best at the table. Here's the door. Come and stay and play if you can. We're not going to keep you out. So these kind of programs say we're smart enough and great enough to make it with everyone. That's a rare statement. If you're excluding people, that's kind of like, what kind of team is that? So these kind of programs give an intentionality to inclusion, and again, to providing the best for the best. Who's us?
So I agree with everything that's been said. I'll add to it that conferences like this give people the ability to make connections to people like them. And that's hugely important. So often, I was a computer science undergraduate. I was the only female ever in any one of my courses in 4 years. Right? So I never made connections to professional women around conferences. No one ever talked to me that I could go, told me I could go to a conference. You know, as an undergraduate at Princeton, you would think that they would encourage their students to go to workshops and conferences, but no one ever mentioned this to me. And I think that that there's a mistake. That's a mistake. And we don't train people to be university professors, right? We train them to get a PhD and be a researcher, and then we announce that they're university professors. And so very likely that when they think of what makes a successful student, they think of themselves as the model, and they kind of pick students who look like them and act like them. And so I think a lot of people just get left out. And conferences, inviting people, making sure that conferences are inclusive, is our way as a community to say we need to get everybody, whether you're left out or isolated in your local environment or not, to be part of a bigger network and a bigger conference. The conferences are also where needing your networking contacts, and that's so critical to careers long term, that if you don't start going to conferences and understanding how that works, it makes it much harder for you. So I think it's a great thing. We have supported the broader engagement and supercomputing, and we've supported certainly the Grace Hopper and the Town Day conferences. Grace Hopper, for example, is focused on women in computing, and we started that, I didn't start it, but it started in 93, I think, 92, 93, and they had 200 women, and this year they have probably 8,000, which just shows how important.
It's actually over 2,000.
Over what?
Expecting over 2,000.
Over 8,000.
Oh, 8,000.
Yeah. So it's huge this year. And I think that's a testament to how important these networking opportunities are for women. And it's true for minorities as well. So it's really critical.
So I know firsthand broadening participation efforts are not all rainbows and sunshine and getting there, and I'm sure you guys have had your obstacles along the way. What have been some of those obstacles that you faced in trying to broaden participation?
So I would say, again, going back to that awareness and bringing it to masses is really having that reach, because right now we use technology to do that, and trying to communicate that these opportunities exist, they're still not reaching. For whatever reason, they're still not reaching. And people aren't applying. This is an example here, right? I don't know how much funding you and Randy had to actually work with this, but, you know, I would love to see them.
We would too.
Yeah, I would love to see them. And the same holds for the other conferences that we're involved with. Well, Grace Hopper's reception, happy as a reception right now, because we have more people. That's the other obstacle in what we can take in, because we don't have enough funding to be able to actually span that growth, scale it the way we would love to scale it. Then you have the other issue. What do you do when you do scale it? How do you build that inclusive environment where that 200 felt very, very, that was a wonderful experience. Now you basically spreaded that out, peanut buttered it out all the way on the bread. Now, what do? So you have to really focus in on how do you build that inclusivity, how do you build that space where everyone has this capability to know. Because once it gets large, it makes it a lot harder. And that was one of the reasons why we decided to do a broadening participation program in high performance computing. As an example, you have roughly 11,000 attendees there. And to have a group of underrepresented folks come in who had no knowledge, access, understanding of what they were getting into, and they see all these folks, you had to build an environment where they feel okay. All right, and gradually move them into the inclusive environment. They just needed we call it an on-ramp. So just an on-ramp into being a part of the community. And that's what we wanted to ultimately do, is just make them be a part of the community. So the last thing I would say is just funding. It's the issue that we bring into that, because not only we're talking about students typically don't have a lot of money, unless, you know, they're well off. But a lot of them don't, in trying to actually come into these conferences, because the conferences are very expensive as well. It's not so much the conference so much, but even the city that the conference is in, the hotel, everything else. So I would challenge you to find friends and to even, you know, get roommates, things of that nature to help, you know, afraid costs for those kind of things. So.
Before you answer, Jan, just as a quick history note, this program's, the blueprint for this program is actually based on the broadening engagement program at Super. So that's where we've taken sort of everything that they did and try to start it up 3 years ago. So if you want to know where it started, that's where it started.
With improvements.
Okay, so I think we're asked for 2 obstacles, but I have 3. The good news I would have to say is that since I've been working on this job now for 10 years, the people who work on it are amazing. Right? The people who care about diversity and are working on diversity and conferences and stuff are just incredibly wonderful people to work with, and they work really hard, and most of them get no professional advantage for this at all. Right? It's just education and outreach are just not something that most universities or industry care about, really. So people do it out of their heart. What stops them? Well, the biggest thing that I've seen that I've really tried to change is we don't behave like a research community. So, or the broadening participation community. Research communities meet, they know each other, they publish their work, they know what's going on, they evaluate their work before they publish it, so we know what the best ideas are, the worst ideas, and everybody in the research community builds on the past history of that community. It doesn't happen in broadening participation. Everybody works in their own little program, which may be great, but it's a local program, it runs out of funding, it's over. We don't know anything, we haven't learned anything about So by and large, I mean, there are examples, of course, we just heard of one where you modeled this on stuff that had already been done for supercomputing, but there's very little of this building on people's efforts. So I really think that we have to focus more on building a community. And the reasons that that's not happening are the other two reasons. One is lack of resources. So it's true that I funded broader engagement, I funded Tapia, I funded Grace Hopper, but that's kind of what I can normally fund, right? So I can't fund every conference, I just don't have that much money. So we fund select things, and that means that the other conferences don't necessarily have someone who's contributing to this. So lack of resources is a big deal. The other big deal is lack of prioritizing, right? Does this community really, not this community here, but this community in this whole meeting, really think of this as a critical issue? I speak at the Computer Science Department Chairs meeting every 2 years. I speak at many, many other meetings. And the diversity group, the discussion is always tiny compared to the overall population. People say they care about diversity, but do they actually put resources into it and work on it? And there's not a lot of that. And the people who do don't tend to be the company heads who tell me that smart people learn it on their own, we don't need to do anything there. So I think that those are the lack of resources and the lack of prioritizing it are important, but I also think that as a community, people who care about it need to be more engaged in that community and building on each other's work. The other thing is when people start programs, they want, and this is true for companies starting programs and individuals, they want to brand their own program. There's a really big emphasis on the not invented here, I'm not interested, right? So everybody, look at all the coding programs that are running around the country right now. There's a gazillion of them. Why don't we take the best and spread the best? Why does everybody have to have their own? And I think that also hurts our community, that companies, when they talk to me about, oh, what can we do for women or what can we do for minorities, and I give them all these options, I always tell them great things that they can just contribute to. They don't ever do that. They decide that they're going to start their own program to do something. And it's just a waste of resources and infrastructure.
So we think we already know how to do it. I think is one of the issues. So I was thinking about this is, we think, and then I'll try to redefine what we is, that a program that is for broadening participation is for a particular set of people who couldn't pay their own way to get there without support. Like that's kind of this assumption that goes into the creation of the program. So with that, if you make that as an assumption, when people pay their own way to a conference and they want to be affiliated with that activity that is broadening participation, we have some wonderful contributing thoughts going on right now.
Really at a peak of many years, it was 40% women again. So in the past few years, they've increased the diversity of
Oh, it's good. It's the right topic.
I
know.
40% is awesome.
Change and attracting more
Maybe we should listen to
data science. It's ensuring that science and technology are considered.
Oh.
Really, from the study unlocking.
I wonder because they're here too, right?
That causes people outside of the usual demographic. And so this really can create
Oh, okay, you got rid of that. It's awesome. Now they might be hearing me.
Right.
That's okay. Let's encourage that.
So let's bring them in the room.
So the broader engagement program at Supercomputing, as it's been named as broader engagement, which also Tony was the creator of that in 2007, as broader engagement, and existed prior to that in different forms. So I've been going to Supercomputing since 1998 as part of the education and increasing representation efforts at that conference. I was never visible as someone participating in that because I never needed travel support. There were other people who were participating in the shaping of that program who were not visible because they were not getting travel support. So what got defined as people who participated were those on the receiving end, right? So then so there's a whole host of people who benefit from the existence of a program that's broadening participation. It's all the individuals in the organization who don't know what to do, but who care about an equitable, in America that has equality everywhere, right? I mean, people do care about this, but they're individuals in an organization. They don't know how to make it happen. So our existence gives them value, but the conference doesn't necessarily create a way for them to be visible in association with this effort, right? And so then the challenge becomes, as you start to make that visible, right? So in 2010, I created this add-on capacity for supercomputing where people could say, yes, I want to be a part of broader engagement. They didn't have to get travel support. They didn't have to do anything else. They just had to say, yes, I'm affiliated with that. So our numbers doubled, right? So yeah, exactly. So they doubled. But then what happened is not the people in broader engagement, but again, the larger community said, oh, well, let's make it so that they can donate to broader engagement, which then puts us back in the receiving end rather than the giving end. We have something to contribute to the conference. So the question is, how do you create ways for people who are a large part of the community to say, I support this. This is important to me. Have that as part of the question, because truly the conference is dedicated to the community of researchers that are present. That community of researchers has a broader awareness of inclusion than the organization itself. And so then it becomes a democratic issue of how do you give voice to that interest. And so I think that's one of the challenges, is that the understanding of how to create inclusion is often in programs that are to build broadening participation. When a conference wants to take what's been built or learned from by that grouping, they don't have that same awareness of the philosophy and approach to inclusion. So there are strategies that are missed. They take elements of a program and spread it, but again, the focus is on how do we let people identify and give expression to their support for this kind of effort.
So in terms of organizationally, I'll take that approach. CES is still pretty much a good old boys network. And I think one of the obstacles I want to say is recruiting, but then in terms of recruiting, policies are now changing. So I think rather than recruiting, I think the obstacle is more of the implementation. So there are recruiters out there who are recruiting in certain areas, and depending on the hiring manager, they'll probably even recruit in non-traditional areas. But really, it depends on the hiring manager to make sure that they have a diverse pool of applicants. So what really annoys me is when I see a new hire, and it's not a hire that I probably would have made in terms of diversity. And I asked the hiring manager, so did you have a female in the pool? And if the answer is no, then my response is usually that you had no business making a decision because you did not have a diverse pool of applicants. So that part is the implementation of it. And the second part is building the pipeline to have the diverse pool of applicants. It takes us a long time, several months, to hire for these technical and scientific positions. And why is that? And I think part of the reason is building the pipeline so that we have candidates who are ready to take these positions. And we have to cultivate that community and let them know these are the resources that's available, these are the mentorships that's available, these are the internships, this is the training programs we have available. And the more people in the community that we let them know that this is going on in the various organizations, the better our pool is going to end up.
What question are we having?
Obstacles?
Okay. So I think mine has already been said, but I will put it in the context. A month ago, we did the broadening participation in AAAI in Quebec City, and it was much like this. We funded students. But some of the students did tell me that some of the challenges they were having was in the fact that they got the travel scholarship, that those in their research groups kind of gave them a hard time as if they were special for getting the travel scholarships. So that's still out there that we have to worry about when we do give out travel scholarships or have these programs. It can actually make it harder for those that don't understand that they're home institution.
I'll add two more things that one was one thing that Janice said was the lack thereof, the lack thereof of individuals at the top really understanding, and that includes the conferences. They don't prioritize, they don't really know why they're doing this, with the exception of it's a good thing. All right, then the other problem that's related to that is that they have no metrics afterwards as to what they accomplished and how they accomplished it. All right, and as a result, those are the things that actually can speak volumes. Understanding that demographic of, okay, these folks came into the conference, how are they contributing? Where are they? All right, are they moving through and being a part of the community? In what capacity? I was just sent an email 2 days ago by SC15 committee folks that are basically putting together a program. It's like, Tony, can you name 3 students or that have been a part of the program that moved through the program and now in a successful area? They should have that. Why are they're picking my brain because for it? I mean, I keep up with a lot of the folks that come through the program, but they should have that data. It should be at their fingertips and understanding where those people in there, because those are the people who are going to help build that community going forward and influence it. So I think that's one of the biggest things that they lack is those 2 components. Someone at the top really spearheading this and then prioritizing what it is that we can try and do, and then the metrics behind it.
Yeah, we need to keep up with that.
I know.
Yeah, let's start taking questions from the audience.
So I'll kick it off. So my question is, one of the frustrating things, especially being in academia, is the notion that people of underrepresented groups are a data point and not a person. So being African American female at Purdue for 6 years, people will come to me and say, okay, how do we get more? And I was always like, we have to treat them like people first, and you can't necessarily think that they're going to be by themselves the whole time. So granted, I was the only one in the department, only one in the college, yada, 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 but I was cohorts of people coming through. So is there a way or a suggestion that you have in order to move the conversation from, as Tony was mentioning, can you name 3? So like these data points of individuals, instead of looking at just the data or the metric, is to actually see people as people and know that their skill set is at a level that is going to be a contributing factor to whatever organization, be it academic, industry, or government.
Love it that you're a data scientist and you're like, I don't want to look at the data. You're at a data conference.
I was thinking about that question of people versus numbers, and that often large conferences like this, so this happened in my own, so I'm a cell biologist who's been doing computational cell biology and in high performance computing since for 18 years, but that the conference said, well, we can't actually look at the demographics of the minorities in the conference, which were some 200 to 400, I would say, right? Because it's such a small percentage of the conference. And it's like, well, for the 200 to 400 of us that are here, which is fairly significant, it's not insignificant, right? And so often people will misidentify the question, and it's an appropriate goal in the long term is to say, yes, the numbers and our overall look at the conference has changed, right? That when you look out at the conference, you can see that we have racial and gender diversity, right? Like that's what you want. But that the change is about creating a context in which people are recognized and supported. So then the question of who's retained, right? So because the loss of particularly underrepresented minorities is not the question of are we coming in, it's are we staying. And so the question of staying is a question, again, of being connected, of seeing that you can, of seeing that of having a relationship built with someone who says, yeah, you can do this, go over there. And that is something about, again, Tony being able to say, hey, I know these people, and at the same time, we do have spreadsheets. We know who applied, we know where they went, right? So I think another challenge in this is for organizations to be willing to get closer to the programs that are being built and the people who are in them, who actually have the breadth of understanding of who's participated, right? So like Beyond Broader Engagement has funded some 45 people to participate in supercomputing. A number of them were poster presenters, paper presenters. They're in the conference, so that's a conversation that we should be having that hasn't happened yet. But it would again move to the people and the numbers.
So I would add to that if you got to remember what community you're in. So, and that's part of the equation, is that you are dealing with a lot of researchers, and data is important. So that's just part of the way you have to do it. I think what you're hitting on is what Raquell really was talking about. How do you build that community? All right, and that's where you can see them as a person, because they're engaged, they're involved in the community. All right, and if they're involved in what's going on, then they see them as a person. You're not a number. Unfortunately, you have to, that number equates to other things, especially as you're putting on a conference and the dollars. All right, that actually, they're thinking about, okay, how much does this room cost? How many people can we put into that room? These chairs cost this much, tables cost this much, food, all these different things come into play. So there's other things you think about, but if you focus in to the people, you get them engaged in the community. And then that's when you start to see them as part of being a person, because they're delivering work that someone sees. And then that person says, oh wow, that was good. You know, or we can basically use that student. Some of the faculty recruit that student that if they're an undergraduate and bring them aboard. I use it as a leverage to see people. And as a result, I work with this lady to do that as much as possible, and all these ladies. That is interesting, right? It was all these ladies at the table we got, but which is wonderful. But that is the biggest thing, is to leverage each other as much as possible, and don't try to reinvent the wheel. You know, so if we can leverage, you know, what people are doing, then you can actually have that voice, and then you can be seen as a person.
And I know this is counterintuitive, but what the studies that have the largest impact on me are the ones that use us all as data points. You know, I find it interesting when you look across the board at what the demographics are of anybody who makes it, you know, to assistant professor or to associate professor. And I think it's good in the sense that it allows everybody to kind of put themselves in that continuum, but as long as we're the only data points, right? So then we're outliers. So the question is, you know, where are we in the pool? Are my publications the same as everybody else's, you know? Did I do the same kinds of papers, you know? And I know that's the data science part of it, but I want to understand the entire community so I can kind of see where we lie in that community.
Well, that's what I was getting to, Monica, was that in my experience, unrepresented minorities have been tracked, but not everyone has been tracked.
Not everyone.
And that's what's annoying to
Yes.
me. And I was,
Because I don't know if everybody heard that. It is, I mean, so a lot of my training in terms of inclusion has come from independent organizations who refuse to study the population that we're serving, because women and minorities are overly evaluated and studied, and it's not that the whole population is then studied with the same kind of questions or scrutiny. Like they're not launched in that same way. And it's one of those things where it's kind of like, well, so then the question is, do you get rid of those evaluations, or do you study the whole population, right? Because, anyway, I wanted one other statement. The question when people ask, you know, we don't have enough, there's also a way, like at some level, it's a question of what do you do with the person who's asking that? And people can ask that or say that from many different vantage points. And one of the things that I think we always have to get better at is recognizing someone who's a potential ally organizer who has a focus that they don't know how to change. So our job is to continue to advance the questions and the way people look at creating inclusion. It's like, so you have the response of, hey, there's not enough. That's because we do have to work at creating an environment where people can be themselves and in the field. And so how are we going to do that? So I have a New England Undergraduate Computing Symposium that is an offshoot from the Empowering Leadership Alliance that has now been sustained for 6 years. It is independent of the grant that was initiated by Dan Cuny. Because it is a collaboration of the local CS chairs with the symposium, which is dedicated to diversity. So we're building community, we're building inclusive community. The demographics fluctuate, just as the New England area does and who's coming through. But that commitment to inclusion has been stabilized because we were able to say, yes, we're going to create an environment for people, and yes, it addresses our issues of numbers. So that building process.
Good. Yes.
Okay, speaking of obstacles in creating inclusion, is intersectionality being actively considered when coming with strategies for in companies, both in companies and people that are dedicated to this? And by intersectionality, I mean how race, gender, economic status intersects into the identity of a person, because, for example, male Latino faces different challenges than a woman Latino that might also be poor or even independent of that economic status.
So I'll speak for NSF. There is a program in NSF that looks at research on broadening participation, looks at different groups, certainly. Many of the projects that we fund cross some of those groups, though. So I fund a lot of projects that deal with women, they deal with minority women, non-minority women. I fund projects that deal with African Americans, but certainly include men and women. So it's hard to, when you're actually building a program, sometimes it's hard to tailor it to a specific subgroup. It's also the case, I think, that while lots of the problems are distinct, lots of the problems are not distinct. And so can we leverage the parts that are not distinct? First thing I did when I was at NSF was I held a meeting to figure out what in the world I was going to do with this program. And I invited people representative of all 5 groups that we deal with. And my idea was that we were just one big happy family, and we would do breakouts with all the groups mixed together. And the first day they all informed me that this is not at all what they wanted to do, because they had separate issues. They were going to meet for their separate issues. And so they did it for the first day. Then we had the reports from the breakout. And there was so much commonality in what the different groups needed as their high-level points. It was really surprising. In fact, Roscoe Giles got up to do the African-American males right after the women's group had talked, and he said, just leave your slides up, I'll use them. And so I think that there are both broad strokes in which these groups should be together, and then there's really drilling down and really looking at the individual groups. In PhDs last year, all the PhDs in computer science and computer engineering and IT, that whole group, there were 0.5% of them were given to minority women, right? Ridiculously low. So clearly that's a group that needs attention. So I think we have to do both, basically. We have to pay attention to individuality. At that same point at NSF, when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, I talked to somebody in Hawaii, because Alaska Natives is one of our concerns at NSF. And when I finished, he said, yeah, but you really can't just talk to me. You have to talk to someone from each island, because they're all right. So you can get too carried away, I think, on granularity too. So it's a balance.
So as an African-American, biracial, lesbian biologist working in computing, teaching improvisational theater to scientists. There are not enough. Yeah, that's quite enough. Working class, middle class. That there aren't enough circles, obviously, and I don't want them to be that many circles, and I can't cut myself up to be in the different places. So it is always challenging to figure out, okay, so now at the meeting, will I go be black? Will I go be gay? Will I go be a woman? Which room, now that they're all like set up at the same time we talked about, should I go into? But there's a challenge that comes to, again, like the question of how we see identity and how we see inclusion. So often what we're looking at is we go to try to find a place that this is what my identity is, rather than us creating a culture where we can all be. So that challenge of figuring out what is the culture, this isn't unique to scientists, is there? What is the culture we have to create that allows us, and all of the complexity of who all of us are, because we're all very complex, to be in the same room together, speaking in a way that is inclusive. Because the challenge about being in a woman's group is it's predominantly identified as a white woman's group, and so issues of race are not talked about, and let alone sexuality in terms of being a lesbian. How many times, I can't be a scientist, I'll be too male. What is that? Like, so, and then issues of class, you know, and like, so that was a big deal in terms of being able to say, I don't know what you're talking about, what literature reference is that? And I'm supposed to have read it, and where did it come from? So then it's like, I'm both learning a field and having class issues, and where's that in that? And so, again, how do you create an environment that is inclusive of everyone is a creative challenge that is an improvisational challenge. But it's a creative challenge. There's not a solution to this yet. So we actually have to continue to address it, and groups, I think, are starting to get better at it. So there is the research being done, as Jan is mentioning, so there's a topic of intersectionality, and I think we have to keep challenging to make sure our voices are part of every conversation.
Yeah, because I feel like the majority of the people, when they think of representation, think of it very broadly and do not consider intersectionality. And do you think that it might be useful to maybe form alliance with people that come from like African American studies or this kind of like this kind of areas, because they do spend a lot of time thinking about these problems?
So I think alliances of any kind are usually something to be encouraged. There's a difference between studying something and creating something. So I think you want to do both. I think you want to learn from what people are doing in terms of their research, but you want to create practices. And I think the challenge as being a research community is to really relate to that concept of practice. What are we doing in practice? And yes, let's learn from that, but you have to create it in order to study it.
Could you give some practical advice for being the only in a situation and not wanting to be the ambassador for someone's cultural or gender or whatever experience to, you know, for your profession? Because in certain situations, I feel that I just want to focus on my work. I don't want to deal with trying to teach you how to interact with me. So if you all could give practical advice on how to do that and to just keep your passion and stay positive in the situation and not get emotionally attached or, you know, bitter.
I just heard an experience from me here, and I'll pass it on to the ladies to talk about that.
All right, well, I'll go first, and my advice would be to not be the only one, right? To find friends. And they don't have to be friends in computer science or whatever your research area is. They could be in biology, in physics, and chemistry. They could be at another university. They could be at another company. You need to have friends. So I didn't do this. When I was an undergraduate, I was the first class of women at Princeton. I was the only female in any one of my classes. I thought that was cool, right? When I got to graduate school, pretty much the same thing. Didn't bother me. When I got to be a faculty member, this was a whole different story. And after 10 years, this group of, turned out to be my neighbor, was a chemist, and we had this group of women from all across the university in different fields and from different universities, and we would start having pizza, and I was shocked by the idea. They had the same experiences that I had, that they had all gone to a meeting where they said something and it was totally ignored, and a guy said it 5 minutes later and it was considered brilliant, right? They had all had these experiences. And so my first advice to you would be to don't be alone. Find other people, even if they're not in your department. And my second is to really focus on your career, right? Because you will have more of an impact on these issues if you have a strong career than if you wash out of your career or leave in disgust after a couple of years. So it is right to be concerned about focusing on your career and not letting your role as ambassador be a distraction, which isn't to say that we don't need ambassadors. And so, you know, do some of that and maybe do more of it as your career progresses, but those would be my two pieces of advice.
I'll be very brief. You do have to teach people how to relate to you. You do not need to teach them how to relate to Black women. Right, there's a difference. I have joined my online mentoring group. We're reviewing these kinds of issues.
I think there are two things. You know, one is you have to give yourself permission to not save the world, right? So there are 50 million things I would have loved to have done, but I had children, and my gift to the world was them staying out of jail, right? So everything else could fall by the wayside. The second thing is you need the person you report to give you that permission. So no matter what my peers expected of me, if my department chair didn't care, I didn't care. And he always had my back, right? So if it's your boss, if it's your chair, whoever that one person is that evaluates you, as long as they understand that your career is your career and not necessarily outreach, everybody else can jump.
Yeah, let's go with Tanya.
I have a question about sort of learning from other disciplines. As computer science, we have a particular problem with our diversity at 2 points of it. Yes, in the middle, but also at the entry and at the end. So at the entry part, we have a real problem at getting people to come to computer science, particularly minorities and women. So we have a huge recruitment outreach issue to high school students to get people to come to start being in data mining. And the other side of it is 40% of people with computer science degree, minorities and women. 40% of minorities and women with computer science degree do not end up working in computer science. And that's true for engineering across the board, so we cannot learn from engineering to deal with it. So we have to go outside of engineering, but it is true for computer science for minorities and women. And it's true for academic, not for academia as well as for industry, and it's particularly bad in industry. So where do we go to learn to deal with these two endpoints of our discipline? The first one, the entry point, has been reasonably successfully solved by statistics and math, actually. The percentage of women in statistics and math have increased over the last 10 years, much more so than they have in computer science. And but engineering is not the place to go.
Yes.
Okay, so the first issue, the entry-level issue, I became convinced after doing writing participation for a couple of years at NSF that the issue is not engagement, right? We can engage kids in computer science. We can engage any kid in computer science. We've got the world's greatest toys, right? So we can do that. But the issue is giving them the opportunity to continue by, one, teaching them something, and two, giving them a path forward. Right now, we do not do that in our society. We teach less computer science in high school now than we did 20 years ago. You are 5 to 8 times more likely to go to a high school that has a football team than a high school that has a computer science course. You know, this is absolutely ridiculous. If you look at where the computer science courses are being taught, they're being taught in the suburbs, right? They are not taught in rural America. They are not taught in inner city schools, right? And so we are missing huge groups of people. And if you look at the computer science that's being taught, even in the suburban schools, it's horrible, right? The computer science current AP test is a year of Java programming. Well, who wakes up in the morning thinking, geez, I need a year of Java programming, right? That's not where kids start, and we don't meet kids where they should start. Women don't think, well, geez, I need a year of Java programming. But women are really interested in computer science if they're shown it in the right light, that it will transform their world. It's their way to change the world. And that's the kind of message we need to give kids. So I've spent the last 6 years working very hard to get great computer science courses into every high school in the United States, and I will go into that here, but I see that as a total equity issue. That's how we're going to get women and minorities into computing. We're going to give them the opportunities to see how great it is and how interesting and transformational it is when they're in school. School is, somebody mentioned the great equalizer, right? That's what differs, from the United States experience from many other countries, is that you can go to school in a public school and get a great education, and the sky's the limit. And we're not doing that right now in computer science. That's on the first end. The second end, I don't have the answer to that. I think it is a big answer. Women leave the professional communities in the professional industry in computer science at a very alarming rate. So it's not just that they go into other fields to start with, but they transfer into other fields as time goes on. I would also say, though, that that's not necessarily a negative thing. You get a huge set of skills in computer science that you can apply all over the place, and the fact that you choose to go apply it in a place that isn't labeled computer science or IT, not necessarily a bad thing. So there's both issues being confounded there. There's the people who are pursuing other interests in a legitimate way and still like computer science, and then there's the people who are leaving in disgust because the community is so unfriendly. That's the piece we have to fix, and I'm not sure how big that piece is.
Actually, the 40% majority, so the recent study that just came out 2 weeks ago showed that the problem is that it's not that we're going to do something good with our computing skills somewhere else. Women and minorities leave computing engineering field because of the lack of advancement opportunities and the climate at work.
Right. So
it's the same reason that they stay there as well.
Yes. So I think that is a huge piece that we have to fix. There's no doubt about that. I guess I was reacting more to the people saying, oh, people got a computer science degree and they didn't go into computer science. That might be by choice. But these women who are being driven out because of the climate, that certainly needs to be fixed.
Create what we want where we can. I'm like, the fact that, so I'm going to pick up on the echo of like, of course, if you're not smart enough to create an environment to keep my smart self, because I am very smart, then I'm going to build something that actually people are going to come and join and is going to compete and outcompete what you're creating. So I think one of the things is at the same time that we need to demand that people create an environment where we can live is wherever you go, create the environment that is taking you to the next level, the ultimate challenge, and creating a place where people want to join you.
Just a data point. In my life, I've worked with 6 major organizations: Cargill, Target, Northwest Airlines, IBM, graduate student at the University of Minnesota, professor at the University of Alabama. Of those 6 organizations, 3 of them were under consent decrees when they hired me. You guys know what a consent decree is? Okay, so a consent decree is you've been sued by some group for not hiring, retaining, advancing a group, and instead of paying people and admitting you're wrong, you basically say that over the next 5-10 years, these are the things I'm going to do, and we're going to have court oversight. So 3 out of 6 of them, I'll let y'all guess which 3 you think they are. But 3 out of 6 of those were already in trouble with hiring, advancing, and persisting people when they hired me.
So I would agree with Jan that we have to focus on STEM for your recruitment piece. That's the #1 thing we actually have to do, is try and engage kids into this area, and the sciences in general, because that's where they're missing it. They don't even understand it, the broad strokes that they can take in this environment. And there's a lot of kids with aptitude to actually come into this arena, and they actually, I almost want to say they basically keep it in because of peer pressure, because of other things that actually go on. But there are a lot of kids that are coming in. Jan's husband teaches at charter school here, and comes out of the Harlem area, and there's a lot of smart kids that actually come out of it. The school that they're basically teaching at, she said 100% of them went to college. That just shows you that the kids are there. And as a result, what we have to pay attention to is how do we actually improve their experience when they actually get it. And then the end point of your question is that it's very difficult because it's a cultural shift. At my institution, we're trying to take steps to, I'm funding a women's workshops and really looking at how we can add topics that senior managers go to, all right, that is centered in on mentoring. Mentoring is the #1 way to actually keep people engaged and involved, quite honestly. Then work-life balance is another one. Having them understand the issues, and having them understand to the point of where not only it's policy, but how it actually impacts them personally, and how they can basically help with that. Now, I do have a hard problem with the advancement piece because people stay around forever in our sort of environment, and as a result, that's a difficult one. But the way we're trying to solve it is that we try to create opportunities where they can actually move into more positions of doing work that they want to do. They're passionate about certain aspects of work, and it may not be management per se. You have to understand what the individual wants, and I think that's where we want to try and get a better understanding is what does that individual want ultimately? Do they want to move into a management role, or do they want to do research and be a program lead or be a group leader centered in around the research that they're doing today?
Let's take one more question. So it's believed that we cannot improve what we cannot measure, right? So every time I read these numbers, about 8% of people are minorities doing something, I usually don't know where these numbers come from. I would like to go one level deeper, for example, say, do we know, for example, what is the email of the Hispanic faculty or the minority faculty in American universities? Or do we know the email of information that the students from minorities actually attend to these events? Do we know what is the main actors, the contact information of the webpage of these people in the industry? And I'm not sure if we have this information, right? So it looks to me like conference or events, UPN, Tapia, Grace Hopper, are like samplings over distribution from different communities. Is there a method for us to collect this information, aggregate in a single place, and say, you know what, these are the main actors of this community? And we don't want to miss it. We want to track them. We want to keep them authentic for time. So probably these are reflections for the next too, but do we actually collaborate with other groups and say, you know what, this is our key data set that we can aggregate and say, these are the people that actually are showing improvement over time and then keep them improving. So do we have a network like that that actually is powerful in over time?
I think that network lives currently with a lot of individuals right now, but I think she may be creating some things along those lines. I'm involved with Happy now. Kyle and Brandy have me involved with this. And then also Grace Hopper, supercomputing. So I try to build those connections and leverage those opportunities. I mean, it's funny, our national lab HR environment is basically taking the notion of really going after what they can do with historically Black colleges and universities. All right, and I told them that they were trying to build a network of contacts and such, and I said, it already exists. Just go to headquarters and get it. Like, no. They still wanted to create it. So she spoke to that earlier. People don't listen to those who basically have a lot of knowledge point and leverage that as much as possible. So it's left to folks organizers who basically do have that information and try to continue. I think we're going down that road even more. I use Tappia's database to reach out. I'll use this database now to reach out. Also try to network with Grace Hopper as well. And then the other sort of conferences that you mentioned. We're doing our best. And now I have a broader stroke that I have to reach with Noviche and some of the other conferences that basically center in on this, because I would like to actually build a network where it's all put in one place. I think it would make things easier as far as communicating.
The government, I work for the government, we have very strict limits on what data we can keep about people. For example, we can't keep their emails. And in general in research, the problem, there's lots of data out there that we collect on how many kids graduate, what degrees you get, what kind of jobs you get. There's PhD surveys, what happens after that. There's a lot of data out there. All of it's collected in different places, and so the definition of what computing is varies. And so the data is not immediately comparable. It's kind of ugly. But the real data that we want, that we can't get, is tracking people, right? We'd really like to know that kids who participated in one of these high school courses I'm pushing, that 5 years later they majored in computer science at a higher rate, or that they went on to do things that were computationally enabled. It's really hard to get that data. There's lots of privacy laws. Parents do not want to sign anything saying you can track their kid. It's really, really difficult to get good data. And what we want to see is, we can see is the size of the pool changing, but that implies that your intervention has to be big enough to really affect the size of the pool, and most interventions aren't that big. So very difficult to get good data. But you're right, we don't really have it.
So I think it also depends on what you want the information for. I don't think you have to measure everything to improve it. You can improve many things without measuring them. But I often wonder so I fly a lot. I'm like, who's got the Yelp on the best airline for relating to people of color? Right? I'm like, I don't want to fly that airline where they're consistently harassing somebody. How come I don't know who that is? Right? So, the question of, so one of the challenges that I think comes out of being in an academic trajectory is we're very used to going to our National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, depending on what your background is, saying, okay, Jen, I want you to fund this. And yet I've been a grassroots organizer standing on street corners asking people to give money for youth development. You can organize things independent of a lot of resources that say, who is this person here? I want to know who Canaro knows, who says, hey, this is the person investing in supporting, people at his institution. Who is that? So there's a lot of agency, is how people would say it, right, that we have in the room where you provide leadership to creating that network reference that we may want for how to advance efforts of participation in the country. So I think, that Tony has these lists is great, and we want to continue to have as transparent an investment in inclusion as we can have, so you know who your allies are and where to go.
So I'll ask one more question. I know we're a little bit over time. And get our pictures. So I'll end with this question. I know you guys have mentioned funding, you've mentioned resources, and obviously that's just a reality of trying to make the difference that we try to make. For our program and for, let's say, other initiatives that folks might want to start in the future and build on, if any of us want to come to you and to your organization, we want to say, we have this program and we've been able to do ABC. What's the most impactful ABC that we can measure for you to take to the head of that organization and say, you know what, they've done ABC. This is extremely interesting to us, and it helps get us funding and resources. So we do have the benefit of being able to measure for our program and being able to track for our program. So what are those things that are most impactful for your own organization?
ABC of basically you having that data as to how many people basically are engaged in the program, how many people are engaged in the entire environment, and then also where they're participating in would be important. And then for us to have information about those who are matriculating up to their PhD. Because we would be interested in, although in our CS environment, we can do associates all the way up to PhD, but that's what we're interested in is really the individuals that are sort of moving up to the ranks, and we have a need now for a data scientist. So, yeah, let me know if you're interested.
So I get this question a lot. How can I get money from NSF question? Basically, NSF is concerned about research. And so we do some implementation, but always to learn something. So it is not the case that I want to, well, I do want to, but it's not the case that I have money to make something slightly better for this community, right? But I have this goal of changing the world. I want computing to be a broad and inclusive field. So how does what you're doing here help me do that? And so numbers are important. What's the participation rate? Do people come back and participate again? But really, it needs to be tied to outcomes, right? How have things changed because of this? What's the effect on the individual? Have people gone on to careers more? Have they published more? Have they, there's a variety of outcomes that you may want. Have they made the move to graduate school from undergraduate more? Have they made the move from graduate school to a degree? Are they more likely to persist in a degree? What is the change that you've made in these individuals' outcomes? That's why I said it's really hard to track these things to figure out what that change would be. And then what do you know about how you accomplish that change so that I can take it to the next community and the community beyond that? So really what NSF wants to do is to fund things that change broadening participation, but in addition, as they're doing that, teach us something that we need to do to change it on a large scale. So it's tough to meet all of those criteria.
So as an independent consulting company with firms and contracted people, what I invest in terms of time or donating like my services is when people say, I have a community of people, or actually I have a set of individuals that want to learn how to create community, how to create inclusive culture, and we need to learn how to do that because we don't know how, and then I show up.
So what's important, I mentioned earlier, is recruitment and building a pipeline. So for programs like this, we want to know that we are able to recruit a diverse workforce. But not just that, but obviously we want to know as a result of what we invested in, what happened to the individual. So not just a data point, but what happened. And building a pipeline, obviously for ourselves, but not only that, but also for the community. So even if the person from this program, for example, didn't come to the lab, we want to know what you're doing. Did you actually stay in CS? Did you actually pursue what it is that you did? And we try to keep track of that.
I'm part of IMCS, the Institute for African American Mentoring and Computer Science. We are an alliance funded by NSF and graciously by Jan. And our edict is to get students to and through graduate school. So our focus is pretty narrow. But things we will fund are REUs, research experiences for undergraduates. So if any of you know undergraduates that would be great at research that need to understand, and we're cross-discipline, by the way, in computer science. Other things that we fund are participation in robotics competitions. We actually have robotics competitions as a way to get students more technical, but also to improve their self-efficacy so that they do persist, Studies show that students that believe they do well persist regardless of their actual performance, which is interesting. And we also do some distinguished lecture series. We partner a lot with other organizations. But beyond that, because I'm a professor, I find that getting funding at my university is kind of easy in some circumstances. I can get the College of Engineering to support things, and they'll give me, I don't know, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 if I can show that I can create a unique experience for our students that they can put on a brochure. If it's visible, it counts, right? And then also we have a community liaison office, and they also give funds for us to engage the community. Fortunately enough, in Alabama, if I go, you know, an hour out from Tuscaloosa, you get into the Black Belt, which is an area that has 50% poverty rates. And so oftentimes I can get money from businesses or the community office to go out and do outreach and engage students, you know, pay for undergrads, gas, whatever, robots and equipment. So there are a lot of ways you can get money, you know, from private organizations or universities.
So I'll add that, you know, to that is
The outcomes piece, success. You have to show that success, all right? And in branding, you know, market it, because that's the way you're actually gonna really get that money, because they see you as being able to help what they're trying to achieve, then you're gonna basically have a, I think, Telly at the Native Board Institute, Grace Hopper, she's a fine example of that. You know, that 200 women getting together, and then it's scaling up to 8,000. And the way she's done it is through partnering with organizations, all right? You know, I'll even get it outside of just seeing it. Just look at the national baseball team that just won. Chicago, South Side, shout out, right? Chicago, I'm from Chicago, South Side as well. There you go, another one. You know, just those kids have basically really enriched a city that is under siege and made them think a little bit differently. There were people donating to just having the families go support their kids. They donated to them. That's what I mean by success. Success does that. And people want to be a part of that. All right? Another one is the Ice Bucket Challenge. So, I mean, you know, you may be crying about them wasting water, but it's successful. It's being successful. It's raising funds. So that is what you want to try and latch onto. It became a market. That was the marketing tool. The Ice Bucket is the marketing tool. They branded it. And as a result, they're being successful and people are donating. All right? And they're donating like crazy and just to have fun. You know, and getting their friends to do it. So to me, that's what you're gonna have to do is show that success.
All right, let's thank our speakers. Well, we've got to be back here at 1:30 to have lunch. I think there's lots of options around.